Former Congressman Bill Owens joins us this week. Welcome. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you, Tom.
So you're attending the inauguration coming up next Friday.
I am. I will be down in D.C. I was fortunate enough to get an invite from the ambassador to the United States from Canada, Mr. McNaughton, and so I'll be attending a several-hour event, actually. It's a very neat kind of program they put on at the Canadian Embassy in D.C. They have a roof patio. It overlooks the Capitol, and so we'll be able to watch the inauguration, have some lunch, and mingle. You know, some of the viewers may be wondering why I'm going down to President Trump's inauguration as a former Democratic member of Congress. The reason I'm doing this primarily is because I think that Canadian relationship for our region, for my old district, is so important that I want to have every possible opportunity to have contacts at the Canadian Embassy. I expect to see Jean-Claude Lauzon, the Delegate General of Quebec there, and many of the consular officials, all of whom are people who have real impact on our local communities. So my primary goal is to go there and maintain those relationships for our region.
What are you expecting for the first 100 days of the new presidency?
Well, I think based upon how the process is unfolding now, it seems to be a little stutter-stepped. It's unclear as to how quickly some of the cabinet officials will be in place because of the ethics office issues related to their financial holdings. So I think it's not going to be as much of a burst as people may anticipate.
And you're talking about some of the confirmation hearings. An issue was whether or not all the background checks had been done and
That's right.
the ethics checked out.
And when they talk about ethics, what they really mean is the financial holdings of the people. What they have to determine is whether or not the position the person holds could affect some of their investments. And if it could affect some of their investments, then they have to do one of a couple of things. They have to liquidate, or they have to put the assets into a blind trust.
A lot of people saying that the confirmation hearings lined up and being jammed through this week. Do you see it that way, or is this truly politics? If a shoe was on the other foot, would the Democrats be doing the same thing? Is this what new administrations do? They line up the confirmation hearings all together to try to get them through?
The answer to that is all administrations do this. What's unique about this is that Mr. Trump didn't expect to win either. And so they weren't prepared. They were not going through the vetting process during the latter stages of the campaign. So all of these people just are getting vetted now, which is creating some of the logjam and some of the confusion.
Do you expect most of the picks will be confirmed?
I do. I would be very surprised unless something develops where one of the nominees says, I will not conform to the requirements to divest or put into a blind trust, then I think that might force that nominee out.
Senator Jeff Sessions being considered for Attorney General. You worked with him in Washington.
I did, and I had the opportunity actually to travel with him to Ottawa for an interparliamentary conference. A very conservative man. I think my impression of him was that he was not a person of a broad understanding. He has some very narrow views, and I have some concerns about him as Attorney General.
In particular, upholding the existing laws, abortion,
I think upholding
gay
existing
rights.
laws, allowing his opinions to influence the positions he might take, irrespective of what the law is, and in particular, the idea that we don't want people going back and revisiting well-settled law. That's a long-standing principle at the Supreme Court and has really been a long-standing principle for virtually every administration.
He said this week he wouldn't do that, but are you
I'm suspect.
Right out of the gate, Donald Trump said one of the first things he would do would be repeal the Affordable Care Act. It appears that is happening, that the Republicans will do that. The big question now is, what do they replace it with and how soon?
I have a slightly different view on that. The recent reports, in particular stories about Senators Paul, Cotton, and Corker, and recently some additions to that, including Susan Collins, indicate that they may not be prepared to vote for repeal without replace. If that's the case and they lose those 4, they will not be able to repeal Obamacare in the Senate. And that will create, I think, a major, if you will, explosion within the Republican Party, because I think the House will go forward, and I think the Senate is more cautious. Obviously, as someone who voted for the Affordable Care Act, I think that it could certainly be improved, but in any event, like President Obama said in his speech, his last speech to the country, if you got a better idea, bring it forward, and I might support it too. I'm of the same opinion. The problem, I think, is that if they go ahead and repeal and delay, which is really what the plan is now, because they have no plan, then you will be in a position where insurance companies are likely to begin to more forcefully withdraw from the market, raise rates even more, and that's a significant problem that could really create chaos in the healthcare industry for not only people who were on Obamacare, but for you and I. Even if we have insurance coverage, those companies will likely begin to ratchet up the rates because they're in an area of uncertainty. And when insurance companies have uncertainty, their actuaries can't do the proper analysis. Their only recourse really is to say, we have to raise rates to protect ourselves.
You talk about people on Obamacare, 20 million plus have signed up for Obamacare. It seems unlikely, though, that their coverage would be taken away, that they would lose their coverage. Would they keep that coverage while a replacement plan is found?
Well, that's an open question. What comes out of the Republicans at this point is an unclear pathway. Some are saying repeal, delay, replace. Some are saying repeal and hedging the bet on whether there's a delay, but saying, well, no one will lose their coverage. The difficulty is they really can't assure that, because the insurance companies may say, you're going to terminate the exchanges. We're not going to wait for that to happen and get caught in July. We're going to terminate our participation now because we don't want to be in a situation where we're not being paid or those whom we've insured can't afford to pay us.
What if that happens?
I think you would have major negative reactions, certainly from the 20 million people who lost their insurance, but we'd go back to where we were before this bill was passed. The estimates are that hospitals nationwide provided between $75 billion and $125 billion of uncompensated care. All those people who lost their insurance would be in a position of having to go to the hospital with no insurance. The hospitals would be required to care for them and would not be compensated. You take $75 billion out of the providers in this country, you're going to have a major problem.
So the hospitals would pick up the costs, the states would have to pick up?
Well, that's a question. Not every state does do that. And that would be an option of the states, because most states provide some level of Medicaid coverage, but in the absence of that Medicaid coverage, that would mean no funds would be going to the hospital.
Do the Republicans have anything on the radar as far as replacement plan?
Nothing. There is no bill that is out there that anyone has seen any detail on. There have been numerous stories that there are plans out there, but it's clear that they haven't agreed upon a plan, and I think they don't really have a plan.
President Obama came to the Hill last week and basically told Democrats to remain firm, to not to negotiate, to let the Republicans, I think in his words, own it. Is that the right tactic?
Well, I think if you listen to what President-elect Trump said, let the Democrats own Obamacare, I think it's a perfectly good tactic to at least start with, you're going to repeal this and you don't have a plan, you own it. Now, if they bring a plan forward, I think that has to change your strategy, because then you have a responsibility to the people of the United States to make sure that you have something in place. And I'm I don't believe the Republicans will have anything for minimally 3 months, and I think more like 6 months or 8 months that they can actually bring in, sit down, and have a conversation about.
If the chaos starts to ensue that you were talking about, though, shouldn't the Democrats, shouldn't it be the responsibility of the Democrats to step in and try to come to some sort of a compromise to?
But the Republicans have control of the two houses and the White House. They have to bring a plan forward. If they do, and the chaos ensues, then I think Democrats do have a responsibility to negotiate. But it's not the Democrats' responsibility at this point to bring forward a plan. It's the Republicans' responsibility. They don't have one. You know, this is like the proverbial dog that caught the car. Oh my, I now have it, what do I do with it? And I think that's a significant problem.
Is some of the lingering bitterness over the election at play as well here, as far as the cooperation level on Capitol
No,
Hill?
I don't think so. I think that most of the people that I know, including Chuck Schumer, Senator Gillibrand, many of my friends who remain in the House, I think if they came forward with a plan that effectively was going to function like a replacement or a modification of Obamacare, I think that they would take a serious look at that.
What else do you see for the Republican-led Congress in the first few months?
Well, clearly, I think they're going to take steps with regard to the border. There's been a lot of conversation about whether or not they're going to build a wall on the southern border, whether or not they're going to tear up NAFTA. So I think that's going to be one of the other areas that they will go after. This issue of raising tariffs, which the president-elect has repeated ad nauseum during the campaign and since his election. I think that that's the direction he really intends to go. I personally think that's very problematic from a national perspective. I also think it's very problematic from our region's perspective. And that to me is very troubling. And I'm hopeful that they sort of get over the Canadian and NAFTA issue and just simply allow that to move on.
Much of his focus has been the southern border and automakers going to Mexico to build their cars. When you talk about the tariffs, though, do you think he would look to put tariffs on Canadian parts coming across the border to U.S. auto plants?
I do. I think that he's made comments about the idea that Detroit should make all of the car and cars in Detroit or in Michigan, and that would preclude moving those cars, as has been talked about many times in our region. Those parts in a car may go back and forth 8-9 times, as you do some work in Windsor and some work in Michigan, and the part moves back and forth. I think that that's very problematic, and I do think, because I believe he does not understand how the process works at either border and how important that process is. His focus really is on this job loss issue and on really Mexican immigration. Job loss issues, that's a scenario that's very complicated. Much of what happened is not related to NAFTA. It's related, certainly in part to NAFTA, but it's also related to improvements in technology and automation. It's currency manipulation by China. That played one of the biggest parts in the 90s and early 2000s, as China basically undercut through their currency manipulation by holding the yen down versus the dollar. So that to me is a real lack of understanding, again, of international trade issues.
So what happens if he imposes tariffs? What's that do to trade and relations between the U.S. and Canada?
Well, I think it will dramatically impact those relationships. I think Canadians will be very frustrated and legitimately angry at us. I think it will cut down the amount of activity that goes on back and forth across the border. One could argue that that could result in more Canadian companies setting up subsidiaries in the United States to avoid those tariffs. So much like Made in America, it could benefit regions in the United States, and ours being one of the likely beneficiaries. Nonetheless, Canada will impose tariffs on our goods going into Canada, which means not necessarily the companies in our region being hurt, but I think potentially in other regions of the country being hurt. So I think it's very short-sighted. We had this kind of go around, in the 30s during the Great Depression with the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which raised tariffs to 50%. And many economists believe that was a significant factor in worsening and lengthening the Great Depression.
NAFTA has been under attack for several months now by all the major political candidates,
Right.
Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, and Donald Trump, but Trump calling it the worst trade deal ever, I think, to quote him. So do you see that NAFTA probably will likely be renegotiated? And Justin Trudeau has said that on Canada's part there's a willingness to renegotiate, but do you think that there's some fine-tuning there, or does it look like it's a trade deal that could be repealed altogether?
My suspicion is that after we get through a little bit of the drama in this, that ultimately they'll do some tweaking, and I don't think NAFTA goes away. That would be a real shock to me if that were to happen.
Locally, community leaders say NAFTA has played a positive role in bringing Canadian companies and business across the border. They point to it and say that it's done a lot for here. You talk about Made in America, which has brought in some of the larger manufacturers like Nova Bus and Bombardier. But has NAFTA in other ways truly benefited the North Country?
It has. Clearly what you see happening, and it's been going on now for 30 years, is Canadian companies will either ship goods here and store them in one of the warehouses and then export them, not export them, but deliver them in the United States. You see a lot of that kind of activity. You see companies coming and doing greater portions of their manufacturing here in the United States, again, because they can bring in raw materials and other partly finished products duty-free if they meet the NAFTA requirements. So I think it has stimulated growth here. It also has stimulated just, if you will, traffic. People can move back and forth across the border easier. They can get trade NAFTA visas. They can get L1 visas. So they're more inclined to come down and do business.
Is that business in jeopardy if NAFTA gets rewritten?
It certainly will make it more difficult, and it may slow down new people moving to the United States. I think that companies that are already here likely have a significant enough investment that they will continue with that investment.
And you talk about the border, people coming freely across the border. Donald Trump's position on the border, obviously most of his focus on the Mexican border. Do we know his position on traffic back and forth between the U.S. and Canada?
No, that's very unclear. The only thing he's spoken about in general terms is, of course, limiting immigration. And he's talking about not just Mexican immigration, but immigration generally. Well, that could have an impact on trade NAFTA visas, the L1 visas that many business owners use to come back and forth to the United States. If that were to happen, that would have a major impact on our community, but on the entire United States and certainly the northern border and the southern border as well. I think, again, that's a very unlikely scenario in the short term. So we'll have to see how that plays out.
Justin Trudeau seemed to be cut from the same political cloth as Mr. Obama in a number of ways. They seem to get along well. What would you see for a relationship between the U.S. and Canada with Mr. Trump and Mr. Trudeau?
I think a lot depends upon how the Trump administration proceeds. So if they proceed in a very aggressive and negative way relative to Canada, I think that will injure that relationship. If they proceed rationally and attempt to renegotiate NAFTA so that it benefits both sides, then I think that relationship will stay at a cordial level.
Both support the Keystone Pipeline. Do you think that could be resurrected?
Absolutely. When I was speaking out in Calgary a couple of months ago, that was the first question that people asked. I think it's very likely that Keystone will be resurrected and Keystone will be implemented. What's interesting about that is that the Keystone Pipeline does not actually bring oil to the United States in the sense to be used here. It's actually oil coming out of the oil sands in northern Alberta to Texas to be refined and shipped overseas. So for the Canadians, that's very important, particularly if our access to oil and natural gas continues to grow. That will reduce what we import from Canada.
We still get most of our
We do. Most of our
energy
imported oil.
from Canada.
Yes.
Do you think the new administration would continue to do that, or would it look to do it to use more domestic oil and natural gas?
Well, I think clearly we've been trending that way since President Obama was elected, and that is the growth of oil production and natural gas are at their highest, I believe, that they've ever been during the Obama administration. I fully anticipate Mr. Trump will keep that going or try and increase it, but every time you do, for every gallon we get here in the United States and utilize, that means we need less to import.
Talking about border security, pre-clearance bill, which has been in the works, you've supported when you were in Congress. One final passage in the House and Senate, the president signed it. What's the next step for that, and what does that do for traffic across the border?
In terms of the next step, the Parliament in Canada needs to act on a similar bill, which is currently, if you will, on the floor. Hopefully they will get to that early this year. Once that happens, then they can take that legislation and implement the pre-clearance agreement. What that really means is quicker passage for passengers on aircraft and trains, buses. It will allow people to be pre-cleared in the sense that they'll submit their documentation so that when they arrive at the border, actually on our side, Customs, and on the Canadian side, CBSA will be able to, if you will, focus on the people they have questions about, the information already submitted.
They're already in the airports in Montreal and Toronto.
Correct.
The hope is to put customs agents now at the central train station in Montreal, pre-screen passengers coming on Amtrak across the border. That would save about an hour at the border if they're pre-screened. The hope is that that might encourage more people to use train travel?
That's right, and don't forget that covers all of the train travel in the going north-south U.S. Canada. So that goes from here to Blaine, Washington. That, I think, is very important, this idea that people can be pre-cleared. I think it will encourage people to do things like Nexus, because they'll now hear some more marketing about, well, if you're pre-cleared, you're going to speed your travel into the United States. And the more we do that, the more we encourage our Canadian neighbors to come down and shop and boat on the lake and ski in the mountains.
Any talk of doing it the other way, that Canada, if Parliament approves it, would put customs agents, say, in Plattsburgh to pre-screen going back into Canada, or going into Canada?
There is conversation about that, putting Canadian border agents in Plattsburgh to pre-screen people on the train. The buses is a little more difficult to do, but they eventually, I think, will get there as well. And airplanes, we don't have direct, and I think it's unlikely we would have direct flight traffic from Plattsburgh to Montreal. But you're right, they're currently and have been for 30 years U.S. customs agents in Montreal at the airport, effectively pre-clearing people. And hopefully that will get enhanced and work better.
Part of this would also possibly lead to Canadian customs being on the Messina end of the international bridge, which has been talked about before. Yes. That's obviously been an issue for a number of years, and that might be a solution, having them on U.S. soil to screen people before they cross the bridge.
That's right, and that's been really in the works for years. I was a big supporter of that when I was in Congress. It made a lot of sense. I think the Native American community is very supportive of that. They have some levels of concern, but I think generally supportive. I think that this would be an excellent way to resolve many of the issues. I don't know how often you've gone into Cornwall off the bridge, but it's a very short space for the clearance when the bridge is in operation. Now currently, because they're doing the bridge construction work, they actually have a pretty decent facility with adequate lane space on the Canadian side. But being able to put people in one location, I think, reduces, if you will, capital costs because you only have one physical facility. I think it will speed up the process for everyone. And I think it's just a great idea, and I hope they get it done.
When you were in Congress, one of the ideas that you supported was sharing of border facilities. You pointed to Churubusco, where the U.S. spent millions to upgrade its border facility. Canada, just a short distance away, a few hundred yards away, closed their facility. And your thought is that this may allow a sharing of the same facilities.
Well, I think, yes, clearly the legislation would be beneficial to that. I think it also just gives impetus to it. Because people are going to want to find ways to reduce cost, and having either a customs officer or a CBSA officer in a building where they can scan your documents, send them on to the appropriate country's clearing facility, and get a message back, and the person is either admitted or not.
Canada, within the next few months, is going to look at legalizing marijuana. Do you think that'll be an issue between the U.S. and Canada? Do you think that could be a point of contention between Trump and Trudeau?
I think it could. And it creates a lot of legitimate, in my view, concerns. So you have somebody who legally uses marijuana in Canada, comes down the road, right? And they still have the remnants in their system. They get arrested for whatever the case may be, and now a drug test is done and they discover marijuana. So where was it consumed? Was it consumed legally in Canada or illegally in the United States? I think that people are concerned, law enforcement is legitimately concerned about people being impaired. Smoking in Canada, coming into the United States, they're now impaired, and it was legal there when they consumed the product, and now they're in the United States and their ability to drive is impaired. You get into some very difficult and complex legal questions. So I think that's a legitimate concern, and I think it will cause tension.
A number of border states, a few, are legalizing marijuana. Maine, Vermont may consider it again this year. As that happens, do you see the new Trump administration raising concerns about that, or even taking steps to counter the approval of marijuana in states? Not only legalizing small amounts for recreational use, but also medical marijuana. Do you think the Trump administration may challenge states that are allowing the use of medical marijuana?
That has not, to the best of my knowledge, been a vetted issue with Mr. Trump and his administration. I haven't heard many comments about that. I would fully expect, given the philosophic positions taken by Trump and his administration, that would be a path they would likely walk down. But I haven't heard anyone talk about that. It's particularly difficult, I think, in this medical marijuana arena, because you're saying, in effect, we're going to take away something that soothes someone's pain and distress. That has a lot of emotional connotations to it. I think they will resist the legalization process, but I'm not sure that they'll go after the medical marijuana piece.
A little earlier, you talked about President Obama and his address this week. What do you think his legacy will be as he leaves office?
Well, I think that his primary legacy, and certainly my view of him, is that he was a person of enormous intellect who gave great thought to complex problems. I think that the fact that what happened for the majority of his years in office, 6 out of the 8, that he had a Republican House and Senate who were populated by people who did not want to cooperate and negotiate. I mean, we know that Mitch McConnell said, my goal is to make him a one-term president. That was the first shot out of the cannon. And that attitude really persisted all the way through. That was very problematic. I think had Obama gotten cooperation, he would have, if you will, come to the middle, much like Bill Clinton did, in order to get things done. But that simply was not possible. And one of the great pieces of evidence of that is when I first arrived in the House, there was probably 120 moderates or so. When I left, about 20. That's a very, very significant and telling issue. People have gotten so polarized that the ability to come together and reach compromise resolutions of issues is essentially evaporated. And I think that's very problematic and very unhealthy.
Even more so than when you were in Congress.
Correct.
And you cited that for one of the reasons that you were a frustration of yours in
That's
Congress.
right. And so it's gotten worse. And I think that the only way that sort of, if you will, corrects itself is you have to see a greater number of swing seats in Congress, where the seat could go either Democrat or Republican. Right now, you have very few swing seats. That number has to grow in order to bring back moderation.
How do Democrats recover after the losses in November?
Well, I think that realistically, they did in fact walk away in large measure from, if you will, the middle class, particularly white voter, by how they talked about what they were doing, where their conversational focus was. I think the reality is that the administration had great success in recovering jobs and the economy. The difficulty is this process of losing middle-class, well-paying jobs began 30 years ago, did not start in 2008. And it was simply accelerated then by the events of 2007 and 2008. And it made it harder to move back into an arena where you have a solid plan for job creation. Ultimately, you have to educate people for the jobs that are available today. That's going to be the key, in my view, to recovering. And in our region, we have Clinton Community building the Manufacturing Institute. We have the AIM project going on. We have P-TECH. Those are all steps that communities need to take. Very important, in my view, that we begin to do that. But this is not a short-term game. This is a much longer-term game. There was an interesting piece on 60 Minutes about 3 weeks, a month ago. They showed a small city in, I think, North Carolina that had big closures of plants, and they brought in a very aggressive economic developer. He brought some good jobs in, but if you looked at the pictures of the floor these people were working on, heavily automated. So what might have taken 10 people before was now taking 2. That's the reality of where we are. And I think that people have to address what the reality is, not what they want the reality to be.
And politically, do the Democrats set their sights on the midterms in 2018 and maybe hope to win the Senate and have win the majority there?
I think that certainly the Senate is probably the most in play. I think it's unlikely in the midterms unless something dramatic occurs that we can't anticipate today. But I think they've got to go back to the state level, and they have to begin to rebuild the party across the board. And in my view, that party has to move towards the middle, has to be reaching out and trying to solve all of their constituents' problems. So that means that the plant worker in Messina needs to feel that the Democrats are going to help them retain or regrow the jobs that have been lost. That's got to be part of the conversation. We were laughing last night because one of my grandsons, the youngest, well, not the youngest now, but one of the youngest, he's 7 years old. In school, they asked him, what would you do if you were president, right? And one of the things he wrote down was, I'd make sure everybody has a job. So my daughter, his mother, sent around what he had written, and all of my other kids chimed in and said, well, at least one person was listening to Dad. Because, as you know, the joke was I always talked about jobs. Yeah. And I think that's so important because, in my view, that's what people really are concerned about. It's the economy, stupid. That's what people want to talk about. The other issues, you can light people's fires occasionally, but really they want to know, what are you going to do to make sure that I have a good standard of living and my children have a good standard of living?
And Trump did that better than Hillary Clinton.
He did it significantly better. It wasn't even close.
Transition of power started off on a good foot, kind of deteriorated over the past few weeks. A lot of it back and forth in tweets. This certainly seems to be how Donald Trump is going to communicate with Americans and much of the world through tweets.
It does. It appears to me to be uncontrolled and lacking in much class or thought when those tweets go out. I think he's going to run into a significantly different environment when he gets to the White House because much of that material will have to be retained and stored because it now becomes, if you will, the property of the government. And so that's going to create some real interesting issues as to whether or not his staff tries to control that tweeting activity.
He raised a number of eyebrows with one tweet in particular about whether we need to ramp up our nuclear arsenal. And that got a lot of people talking, with Putin talking tough about beefing up Russia's nuclear arsenal. Do you see an escalating nuclear arms race between the U.S. and Russia developing here?
Well, that to some extent depends upon how Trump's relationship with Putin goes. If in fact he becomes friendlier and has a better relationship, then maybe that is not an issue. But I can also see at the same time Trump deciding that he's going to do some interesting arrangements with Putin and others. And I think ultimately we get back to maybe not the Cold War, but certainly a tense relationship with the Russians.
If he wants to have better relations with Putin, that's one thing. But of course, over the past couple of weeks, the question raised, is he ignoring U.S. intelligence about Russia's interference in the election? Many people are calling for, if not keeping the sanctions that President Obama has recommended, or increasing them. But is that troubling to you that he seems to be discounting all the intelligence on the interference by the Russians in the election?
I think it's very troubling to me. I think the fact that he makes statements like, I don't need to attend the daily briefings on intelligence, that I know more than the intelligence community, that I know things the intelligence community doesn't know. Those do not display, to me, the intellectual and emotional characteristics I'd like to see in the White House.
If there is an escalation in nuclear arsenals, both by the Russians and by us, is that good for the North Country? Does that increase the likelihood that the East Coast ballistic missile site that has been talked about, but that the Pentagon hasn't called for, would get approval and be built? So in a roundabout way, would it be beneficial to the North Country? Fort Drum being the site that's being
the site of that, right.
Yeah.
You know, I worked very hard with DOD to make sure that Drum was one of the 3 finalists in that project. The concern, well, I think it's unlikely that if they revamp the nuclear arsenal, that would have a direct impact on that decision. Because I think what Trump is talking about is upgrading and creating, or if you will, buying more missiles that can deliver the payload. So I'm not sure that that has a direct impact on that site. And you know, there's a lot of legitimate concern about building that. But I also think that depending upon, again, how the Trump administration goes, do they focus on, if you will, hardware, or do they focus on cybersecurity? You know, that is going to be a very telling piece. But more broadly, revamping your nuclear arsenal costs a lot of money. And if you have, and this is one of the other areas of tension I see developing in Congress, particularly with the more conservative Republicans. And that is, you're going to decrease taxes and increase the deficit. You're going to raise tariffs. You're going to spend money on the wall. You're going to spend money, increase spending on the military. You're going to take steps to increase the nuclear arsenal. Those are significant impactors to the budget, the deficit, and the debt. And how far the Republicans, the conservative Republicans in Congress, will go in allowing this to occur, I think is still an open question.
Is it more than just the conservative Republicans, though? I mean, the last defense bill gives the Pentagon authority to start researching, testing, and developing a space-based missile defense system that could cost hundreds of billions of dollars. We didn't hear when President Obama and Democrats raised points and contentions about the defense bill. There wasn't a word about that.
Well, I think that becomes an allocation of resource question, right? Where are you going to spend your dollars? Do you spend it on new airplanes, new aircraft carriers, a space station, a space defense system? And they're going to have to sort that out. But at some point, they will come to the ultimate question of how much are they willing to increase the deficit as they go forward. And I think that's going to be a very important line in the sand that we don't have the answer to yet.
As always, Bill Owens, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us.
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate it.